Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. In the past on this channel I often talk about various different important parts of fighting game history, with the coveted Marvel vs Capcom series of games being no exception to this. Hell, the most popular video I have ever uploaded covers the subject for crying out loud, when I published a ridiculous 2 hours and 18-minute long video covering the history of all the key entries from this chaotic crossover franchise. From the first X-Men vs Street Fighter tag team game, to the critically acclaimed Marvel vs Capcom 2, to even the dubious Marvel vs Capcom Infinite. We have looked at all of these bad boys. While this is very much the case, there remains to be one Marvel vs Capcom game that I have still somewhat overlooked and not discussed quite enough. The game I am referring to is Marvel vs Capcom Clash of Superheroes, released back in the day for the Sony PlayStation. A title that, while sounding like a conversion of the arcade game carrying the same name, is actually something quite different. In fact, to back this point up further, over in the game's native home of Japan, the game was considered mechanically different enough from its arcade counterpart that it would end up carrying a completely different name entirely. With that said, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Marvel vs Capcom Clash of Superheroes EX Edition, a game that offers a lot more difference than it is usually credited for. Yeah! The story of Capcom crossover game home console conversions is a turbulent one, littered with successes and failures. Nothing is more evident of this than looking back to the release of X-Men vs Street Fighter, for household platforms, with the Sega Saturn version of the game being considered near arcade perfect, and the Sony PlayStation version of the game being considered as somewhat of an abomination. What is quite tragic about this tale is that Capcom originally had no intention of creating an X-Men vs Street Fighter game for the hardware to begin with the company announcing that the game was going to be a Saturn exclusive during a press conference in 1996. With the Sega Saturn failing in the West though, and Capcom being accused of favouritism, Capcom would later rescind their announcement, stating that versions of the game would be released for both platforms and they would both be arcade perfect. History now reveals that a very different set of events would unfold, with the Saturn getting a good conversion of the game in November of 1997, with Sony fanboys having to wait until February of 1998 before they had the opportunity to play their piss poor port. Referring to the PlayStation version of the game as a port though is quite generous, with Capcom of Japan seeming to feel the same way, renaming the so-called PlayStation conversion X-Men vs Street Fighter EX Edition. The game was lacking in comparison to its Saturn and arcade contemporaries, which was put down to the PlayStation's memory limitations at the time. Both the game's gameplay and graphics had been altered heavily, and not for the best, with character sprite animations being notably missing, and more appalling, tag team combat had been omitted. The tag team mechanics that were present in other versions of the game was amongst its coolest features, and the fact that they were absent from the PlayStation port was a sad state of affairs to say the least. The 2-on-2 matches were gone, and in their place were traditional best of 3 round fighting game encounters. Instead, the second fighter who players chose would be restricted for use as part of certain attacks, such as variable combinations and counters. While this game lacked in originality when compared to the superior versions of the game, Capcom would try to make up for the shortcomings by including the likes of a training and survival mode. However, neither of these features were enough to stop this conversion from receiving the negative reputation it has today. With events transpiring in such a way, Capcom would find themselves in a somewhat undesirable situation with regards to their many 2D fighting games. By this point, the Sony PlayStation had very clearly become the dominant game console that generation, but it certainly was not the 2D powerhouse that the Saturn was. The PlayStation simply didn't have enough RAM to be able to load all the frames of animation in what were necessary for many intensive 2D fighting games, often resulting in missing frames and gameplay that was on the choppy side. Tag team mechanics were taken out of X-Men vs Street Fighter, for example, as the PlayStation wasn't capable of holding 4 fighters' animations in its working memory simultaneously, which is why we got a game with such substantial changes. With this problem being evident, Capcom were going to need to get a bit more creative with the conversion of their fighting games if they wanted to satisfy consumers who own the most popular platform of that generation. But keeping all of this information in mind, this would be why games like Street Fighter 3 would have to wait until the release of the Sega Dreamcast. X-Men vs Street Fighter's sequel, known as Marvel's Superheroes vs Street Fighter, like its predecessor, would not arrive on the Sony PlayStation until several months after its Saturn debut. Once again, carrying the EX Edition subtitle in Japan, PlayStation owners found themselves in a similar situation to before, whereby Saturn owners in Capcom's homeland would get something near arcade perfect, whereas they would get something a little more watered down. The real question is though, did Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter EX Edition manage to deliver a more solid experience than the EX Edition of X-Men vs Street Fighter? Well, not really, to be honest, but the devs did add even more modes this time around to try and help create an illusion that PlayStation owners were getting a bit more bang for their buck. This time around the game included 5 play modes, including Battle, Versus, Training, Hero Battle and Crossover. In regards to the latter 2 play modes, Hero Battle is an endurance mode involving stables of fighters, whereas Crossover mode brings tag team gameplay to the PlayStation. Well, kind of at least. You could already dabble with this feature within X-Men vs Street Fighter EX Edition, but in Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter for the platform, we get a whole play mode with tag team matches. Well, tag team matches if you and the computer use the same 2 characters. A cheeky workaround that allows 4 fighters to appear in the same match. I guess you really could have 4 fighters in play simultaneously in a PlayStation game, provided the moveset and animations for only 2 characters was held in the system's working memory. What a farce! Now this brings us along to the main event of today's episode, and the final game from this crossover franchise to ever see release on the Sony PlayStation, Marvel vs Capcom Clash of Superheroes EX Edition. By the time that this game made it to homes, Sega's next generation of hardware was here, and in the form of the ultra-powerful Dreamcast. So the difference in 2D capabilities between Sony and Sega systems was now at an all-time high, with the PlayStation massively lagging behind in comparison. What it lacked in power though, it more than made up for in popularity, so once again a PlayStation version of the latest Marvel and Capcom crossover fighter was obviously published. While this EX edition of the game was lacking in similar areas to its predecessors, including the usual omissions of traditional tag play, Marvel vs Capcom on the PlayStation would try harder than all previous PlayStation ports to attempt to be a game that offered some benefits that its more powerful brethren did not. So essentially, rather than just being a poor imitation of its arcade counterpart, Capcom would try harder to make this game stand out and be different from the crossover games that had previously been ripped apart by critics. As an EX game, the title obviously already had elements that separated it from its source game, most notably the one-on-one rounds-based matches and overall less animation frames. For the bouts in this game, a number of mechanical changes were implemented to separate gameplay further this time around. An argument could be made that changes are actually done for the better, rather than simply due to the system's limitations. YouTuber Maximilian Dude, for example, highlighted this in the past, even going as far as to hypothesize that the PlayStation's EX version of Marvel vs Capcom served as a testing ground for mechanics that would later become a huge part of Marvel vs Capcom 2. The craziest example of this relates to the fact that the EX version of the game contains delayed hyper combos. DHCs would play an integral part in Marvel vs Capcom 2's play. They can be described by when you cancel the super attack of your point character with a super from the next character. In regular 3-round encounters in this one, players must choose between partner heroes, regular playable characters, or special heroes who are assist characters. Partner heroes participate to help with team hyper combos and cross counters. In this version of the game, it allows for fighters to be able to cancel hyper combos into another hyper combo of their own, or even into a team hyper combo. It is interesting to see features like this in a Marvel vs Capcom game that was pre-Marvel vs Capcom 2. Essentially, the whole experience gives players more things that they can do in combat to somewhat make up for the lack of tag team action. Due to this, there are a number of move combinations that can only be performed in this version of the game. For example, in the PlayStation port, Mega Man gets a secret third hyper combo based on his ending, Onslaught's magnetic shockwave. To use it, one has to win the game with him and then choose him while holding the select button. In fact, lots of examples can be found online of players performing all sorts of weird and wonderful attack combinations that can only be performed in this very specific version of the game. Further changes include zoom effects when fighters perform air combos, a feature known as a dynamic mode, which if players find too distracting, they can manually turn off. There are also more palette swaps on offer, allowing gamers to play as fighters in more different attires than in other versions, and in another cool mechanic, Ryu can switch his moveset mid-play between his own, Ken Masters, and even Akuma, leading to all sorts of chaotic assaults being possible. Ryu's loading screen image in the PlayStation port dubs him Complete Change Ryu. This mechanic was later somewhat mirrored in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 as well, as Sakura is given the ability in that game to transform into Dark Sakura from the older Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter title. When we consider that the PlayStation version of the game was never going to fare as critically well as its Sega Dreamcast counterpart, it is really cool to go back and see that rather than just pushing out another underappreciated PlayStation conversion of a crossover game, that Capcom appear to have used this moment as an opportunity to experiment with mechanics to utilise in their future. All in all, resulting in a video game that offers something different than the other EX crossover games that came before it on Sony hardware. While this game was obviously not receiving any awards on release, it is really interesting to see that it holds some intriguing, significant features that floated largely under the radar at the time. Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes EX Edition really is a different game that tried to bring its own things to the table. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes EX Edition. Almost a completely different game than what could be found in arcades or on the Sega Dreamcast. If you are new here and enjoyed today's video, maybe I can tempt you into checking out my ridiculously long 2-hour and 18-minute upload covering the whole crossover franchise in depth. However, if you want something a little lighter, check out my video on the bizarre Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Walmart Midnight Tournament Edition. That upload offers a strange tale in its own right. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, hit that notification bell and leave a comment letting me know what you think I should cover next. And if you really want to help me out, why not consider backing this channel over on Patreon? Speaking of my generous backers, your glorious support means the world to me. So I would like to give special thank yous to Ben Harradine, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Johnny Holly, Run Ditched, Evan Border, Azrar Kai, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, House of a Ted, Matt File, Steve, Justin Wang, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Sang Hee, Langston Miller, Flaming Renee, TOG Driver, Luis Viant, John Bates, David Ball, Antonio Rodriguez, Since Spaces, Punk Toast, and everybody else who backs my work over on the Patreon platform. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. Yeah. Cheerio.